As you know, if you're following the channel, I quite like standards. I'm a bit geeky like that. I like all the sort of like all the net zero standards. And a big day yesterday for me, very exciting, is the launch of the new SBTi, the Science-Based Targets Initiative standard, the Corporate Net-Zero version 2. I quite like science-based targets as a standard. I think it's got an absolute place in the hierarchy of standards. And so when they said they were going to sort of bring out the next version, I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. So what I've done is I've read the standard. So I haven't read every word, I'll be straight with you. It's 100 pages, but I've read it. I've summarized the changes for you. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to tell you what the new 42% content is about, i.e. they've changed 42% of the standard, which is quite a lot. What the changes are, what the main changes are, whether it applies to you, what the timescales are, and what you've got to do in this new regime. And it's a big change. It really genuinely is a big change. So if you're one of, I reckon there's about 2,000 to 3,000 companies in the UK that are SBTi accredited. That's just an estimate. But if you're one of those companies, or you're thinking of science-based targets as a sort of a standard, then this video is for you. All right? Okay, I'll see you on the other side. So the biggest change, the kind of fundamental change that runs through all of version 2 of the standard is this idea that, you know, the version 1 was all about setting targets. You know, you had to set a near-term target and a long-term target, and you had to kind of say how you're going to get there, etc. And it's true to say that a lot of people will set a quite realistic near-term target. Long-term targets, some of them were quite fanciful, I've got to say, the ones I've seen. But that was what it was about. It was about setting targets, yeah? And once you set the targets and you got them validated, everybody went, yay! You got the applause, and you got on with life pretty much as usual. That's changed now, because version 2 is all about deliverability. It's about setting a climate transition plan, publishing a climate transition plan, reporting against that every year, and splitting the whole thing up into bigger 5-year cycles, again with this idea of publish what you're going to do, report against your progress, review in 5 years. So they've moved from this era of, you know, validate, press release, woohoo, into, well, no, now let's get on and do it. Let's see how well you're doing. Let's see, you know, whether you're meeting the targets that you set yourself. Okay, that's the big change. The standard itself, let's just show you the standard. That's a picture of the standard, isn't it? I mean, it's 100 pages long. Okay, fine. That's probably good length for a standard like this. You know, I mean, the last TCFD standard that I saw, the detailed standard, ran to 500 to 600 pages of close play. It's just a nightmare. But it's about 100 pages long. And if you look inside of it, let's just show you this here. What I've done is I've been through and looked at the number of requirements that the standard has. And I'll show you about company A and company B in a minute. They're basically, company A is larger company B is kind of more SME. And I've split these into columns of mandatory requirements for larger companies, mandatory requirements for SMEs, optional and optional. And so in total, if you're a larger company, there's about 200 requirements you have to meet. And for company, you know, for SMEs, there's about another 200 requirements you have to meet for the standard. But don't forget, you've got this annual and 5-yearly cycle going on in the background. What's interesting to note here, if you look at the numbers, is the sort of the number of requirements about target setting and, more importantly, target implementation. Okay, so this is the fundamental difference between version 1 and version 2. It's not about setting targets and then getting on with life. It's about the implementation of those standards, which is absolutely brilliant, absolutely what's required. Maybe that's one of the reasons that I'm such a big science-based targets fan. Okay, so what else? Well, the first big change is mandatory transition plans. Okay, now, if you're in a category A company, i.e. a larger company, they are absolutely required. Category B, you know, the SMEs, they're optional. But you have to publish one and you have to then report against it, okay? Now, the big change that happened in the UK, I think there was an absolutely brilliant move by DESNZ, the kind of the government body responsible in the UK for you know, our move towards net zero as a country, is that they actually put board responsibility into the streamlined energy and carbon reporting and ESOS, and I'm sure it'll be there in the new IFRS reporting system for the larger companies. But they've done it with SBT as well. So the climate transition plan that you have to publish if you're a larger company must be signed off by a board member. So suddenly you've got this board involvement going on. And, you know, it's not just a case of setting targets, forget about it. You have to report each year. It has to be signed off by the board, you know, each year and each 5-year cycle. So that element of kind of involvement of senior management is absolutely new. I've seen so many of these sort of plans being done by groups of people without buy-in from senior management. They've got lip service. They don't really kind of buy into it at the highest level. And because it can do so much good for your business, it's absolutely right and proper to involve senior management in this. And that's what you've got with these mandatory transition plans for these larger companies. So, instead of just publishing it and getting on with it, we've now got homework. You have to publish it, you have to have 12 months validity on the climate transition plan, it has to be signed by a board member, and you will get judged by your progress against that plan. That's the first big change. The second big change in the standard is this idea that I think they brought it in probably about 18 months ago, maybe 24 months ago, with this idea of SME compliance route. Well, they've now kind of put that to one side, and they've changed that now to this category system of category A versus category B. And if you're going to do anything, if you take away anything from this video, just make sure you're in the right box, right? Because if you're in category A, which is larger companies, rather than category B, there's a significant degree of extra work involved, okay? The corollary of that is that if you're in category B, if you're a smaller company, suddenly you've got less work to do. A lot of it can be optional, as I think we saw with those earlier numbers, but you've got less work to do, and therefore it should be an easier standard to obtain for you, which I suppose is good news. If we look at the categorization table, I like this. Let's just pop that up here. Because what we're seeing here is they're defining a category A company must meet any of the criteria at the top, like 450 million or FTE greater than 1,000. Yeah, that in my experience is most enterprise companies, who are listed anyway in the UK. The majority will fall into that category. And then the next level down, again with my UK lens on, and apologies, I know this is followed by visible people from other territories as well, but with my UK hat on, this is the definition more or less of the ESOS criteria and the SECR criteria in the UK. So we've got this idea that it's 2 out of the 3 of balance sheet, net turnover, or number of staff. And roughly speaking, that's the same as the ESOS definition or the SECR definition in the UK. So you've got category A is large listed. Category A is also anybody who would qualify for SECR and ESOS. There's about between 7 and 11 million companies in that category. Sorry, that's 7,000 to 11,000 companies in that category in the UK. Depending on how you count it, that kind of number. And so add the listed companies in, that probably affects total category A companies in the UK around about, as I say, 7.5 to maybe 11, again, depending how you count things. Companies in the UK will be caught as a category A. And category B, nice and simple, if you're not category A, you're category B. And that means that if you've got a 50-person company, your rules are different to if you're Unilever or something like that. Okay, so they've got this idea of category A, category B. What you then do is they then apply that to what you must do. And if I just bring this slide up, so you can see if you're category A, you've got to report near-term targets for scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Okay. If you're category B, scope 1 and scope 2, but not scope 3. Get the gist? Less work to do. And scope 3 is the hard one. Scope 3 is where everybody kind of stumbles. And you only have to do that if you're kind of, in this larger category group. The other things you've got is long-term targets are completely optional for most people for scopes 2 and 3, and scope 1, it kind of depends on how you've gone about targets. I'll be going on to that in a bit more detail a bit later in the video. And the net zero targets for it, i.e. getting rid of residual emissions, etc., are completely optional. And again, I'll come on to that a bit later on in the video. And that changes in 2035, I think, for larger companies. But can you see what I'm saying? If you're a smaller company, you've got less work to do, much easier to get sort of qualification. The next change to think about is that they've separated out the targets for scope 1 and scope 2, and that shuts this door on this loophole that loads of people have been using by saying we're switching to green electricity, and the savings we're going to get there, they offset the savings we should have been getting by looking at our fuel use and our gas use. It's a classic one, instead of buying normal electricity, you buy green electricity, and that you can use those savings against your targets. Well, they've shut that door now, okay? And you're not allowed to do that. You have got separate targets for scope 1 and scope 2. As a complete nerdy point here, if you're a very large energy user, you have to look at not just are you buying green electricity, but you have to match it up on a half-hourly basis on the settlement system that you'll be using. In my experience, that will apply to a very, very small number of clients of ours at Enistic anyway, so it's probably not one for this video, but I quite like that little kind of shuffle they put in there. In terms of setting the scopes, nothing much has changed with scope 1. If I just bring this up here, you can do absolute or intensity, and absolute being they were this, they're now that, and that's how we're going to get there. Or you can say it's X emissions per Y thing you're doing, and that means that as your company grows and shrinks, if you use the intensity basis, that still applies, and it's more applicable than if you just set an absolute target. And in my experience, people tend not to set absolute targets; they tend to go for intensities. Scope 2 has got an interesting little tweak. So when you're setting your targets for Scope 2, this is new, and I quite like this. You can actually say, you can do the absolute emissions, fine. We can use this, what do they call it here? Low carbon electricity alignment, or LC alignment, which is basically you can declare what percentage of green renewable electricity you're going to be buying over time, and you can track that as a route to compliance towards your targets. So that will help a lot of people. And as it's Scope 2, to be absolutely frank, it's dead easy to do. And I'm quite surprised more people aren't doing it anyway. Most of my clients kind of buy 100% green anyway, so maybe they're at the top of this thing, almost by de facto standard. There is a little tweak in there as well, just something to show you. The UK government defines, can you see my mouse? Yeah, I hope you can see my mouse. Just here, where they define low carbon energy, i.e. solar and wind, etc., as having this figure of 0.048 or less kilograms. Interesting that a lot of stuff we do in the UK, they define it as zero. And I've always had a bugbear about that. Solar and wind are not zero. They're small, but they're not zero. They do have emissions involved with both the manufacture, for example, of the wind turbine, the installation, the maintenance, etc., etc., etc. So I quite like to see that this standard, maybe again, that's another reason I like science-based targets, they've got that little geeky tweak, again, which I quite like. The fourth change is really quite good one. I really like this one. They've taken a complete chainsaw to the way that Scope 3 targets are set and Scope 3 emissions are sort of treated, and it's a good change. Before, it used to be if your emissions comprise 67% or more of Scope 3, you had to do stuff with Scope 3, both report it and sort of meet targets. Now, they've changed it completely, so if any one of the 15 Scope 3 categories represents more than 5% of your total emissions, then you have to deal with it. If not, you can ignore it. And I think you have to say why you're going to ignore it. But that's brilliant. How many times have we all sat there and worked out what the carbon emissions of such and such and such are and what you're going to do about them? But it's a tiny number. By using this 5%, it means you can concentrate your efforts on what is material and just forget about the rest, okay? This makes it more workable, it makes it easier to understand, it makes it more practical, and don't forget you have to report against these things. You can actually put proper measures in to reduce and report against them. And if we look at the pathways for that, let's just pop this slide on here. There's another brilliant one in here, which is you could do the absolute emissions reduction targets for Scope 3, that's fine. But the one I like here is this top one up here, is you can look at your suppliers and customers notice. So it's a dual-sided kind of, it's not just upstream, it's downstream as well. But you can look at them, and if they have a published and authorized carbon reduction system in place, or a net zero system, so for example, they're SBTi themselves, or they've got, ISO 14, and then fill in the blank 68 or 60, depending on your flavor, or they IFRS, etc., then you can count those suppliers and how many of those suppliers you use compared to just all suppliers as a really good route for reducing your supply chain emissions. And that is absolutely brilliant. So you can look at your tier 1 providers and say, right, we're currently 15% of those have got published plans. We're trying to boost that up to 80% over the following timescale, etc. Absolutely spot on. And that's what the industry needs. And that's a good change in this new standard. Change 5 is a real practical one. Again, I like it. It's that if you have a declared target, but something happens that is outside of your control, they don't take the qualification away from you. Okay, they don't remove your certification because you're trying your best, you're doing all the right things. Something happened, it wasn't in your control, and you're allowed to say, as long as you're honest about it, that you can try and do what you should be doing. And if something happens, again, not in your control, there's some structural change somewhere or other, you can say, look, we still want to remain SBTi approved, accredited, and they will let that happen as long as you're honest and transparent about it. What that does is it means that, once you've got your accreditation, you can keep it, as long as you're doing your best and doing so honest and transparent reporting, etc. And if something happens, they don't take it away, which is I've not seen many times, but it's galling when it happens. Actually, it's not my fault. Okay, that's change 5. Change 5 gets rid of one of my biggest bugbears with the old standard, which is this long-term target affair. If you've got, one of my clients has got about 300 articulated lorries on the road at any one time. That's their business, right? That's what they do. They're in logistics. And to say that they're going to get to net zero in 2050, I hate the long-term goal, it's so far in the future. You end up saying things like everything will be made with recyclable materials and they'll all be electric and they'll be powered by solar, etc., etc. And no one knows, right? It's just so far in the future, it's just guesswork. So what they've done with the 6th change in the standard is they've introduced this concept of rolling kind of 5-year reviews. So you don't so much set a plan for 2050. They want you to kind of talk about that, but more realistically, what you're going to do for the next 5 years, where are you now, where you're going to get. Don't forget you've got the climate transition plan and annual reporting along the way. And then these 5-year cycles, you have to publish, you have to refresh, you have to renew. If you're a larger company, you're also going to have to get that signed off and verified by a third party, something called limited assurance, which I'm sure will cheer the accountants up because they charge a fortune for doing it. But, that's this 5-year cycle. When you do one cycle, finish that one, you do the next cycle. Okay? And so you're not saying we're going to hit it by 2050 and by then I would have retired, you would have retired, no, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a pie in the sky dream. It's let's concentrate on the next 5 years, see where that takes us, right, et cetera, et cetera. A much better idea. Okay? It suddenly means that this long-term plan, this long-term objective is now your problem, not somebody else's problem. So that's a brilliant change. I like that. Well done. Change 6. Change 7, and the last one I'm really going to focus. I'm going to recap kind of at the end. But the last change 7, is all about removals and sort of offsets. And why do I like this? It's always been a bit foggy before about whether renewals and offsets were part of the standard. They weren't for one period of time. Then they were introduced and everybody said, well, you can't do it. Blah, blah, blah. Now they're fair and square in the standard. And I'll show you the kind of timeline that you're talking about here, because it's got an interesting little tweak in it. Okay, this is the timeline. They're saying that the responsibility for doing offsetting or removals, and a bit more on that in a second, is optional for phase 1. You see down, hopefully you can see my mouse. Yeah, I think you can. Phase 1 is optional, and they're going to recognize companies that do it as either engaged, I don't suspect that means you do it all, advanced, you do it well, leadership, you're best in class. Okay, so you can actually start getting recognition for the level of offsetting you're doing. That's good, because that's new, and people like the SBTi, they like science-based targets, and they like the recognition and the kudos that affords them. Suddenly you can get this extra level saying, not are we only doing the net zero pathway, but we are offsetting, we are removing. Optional up to, I think it's 2035, when, oh yeah, it is, for larger companies, they're required to start introducing offsets and removals. So again, this is new. Again, this is along the lines of everybody wants you to do offsetting, they want you to do removals, etc. And this is the first time it's actually, if you want the standard, you're going to have to. Okay, now, side note, neutralization number 3, which is in, near around 2050. Neutralization, I think by what they mean there is removals. I'm not sure, but all the removal systems I've seen are hugely expensive. So hopefully, I don't know whether by 2050, actually sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere is suddenly a lot cheaper than it is today, and here we are in 2026, and it's jolly expensive. I don't know, but the whole concept of neutralizing or removing from 2050 onwards, again, first time I've seen that written down. So offsets and removals are now absolutely part of the standard. Optional to start with, mandatory a bit later. So that's a broad outline of the changes in there, the big ones anyway. When do you need to start doing this? Well, you can carry on doing what you're doing now for the next year and a half, but you should be looking at the version 2 standard ready, so 2028 you revalidate under the new standard. So from early 2028, I think it's January, February, you have to revalidate to the new standard. And that gives you time to sort of cross over between standards, because there are, as you say, quite a few changes. What's my takeaway on the whole thing, on the new version 2 standard? I love it. I love its pieces. I've always been a big fan of science-based targets. I think it's a very practical standard to apply. It's not that difficult. It's easy to understand, it's easy to comply with. And, Enistic will be taking all of our sort of science-based targets clients through the new changes and seeing how we can get a sort of a transition plan organised between what they're doing now and where they need to be with the new standard. But the winners here, the winners of science-based targets under this new standard, are the people who make the best pledges. Okay, they're the people who make the pledges, have got transparent data that they can then put through a rigorous audit system and be held to account at board level for what they've, not just what they've pledged, but what they've actually done. And that is just superb. It's exactly what we need. It's exactly the right time. We're moving now away from, this is what we're going to do, yay, to this is what we've done. Look at what we've achieved, and that is going to be good news for a large number of people, a large number of companies worldwide. And I wish them every success with it. I hope it takes off brilliantly. If you'd like to see whether any of this applies to your company, and if you're interested in science-based targets, give us a nudge at Enistic. You'll find, just put enistic.com into any of the search engines and you'll find us. And we can offer you kind of a review process through to see whether it applies, what you can do, what it might cost, what's involved, etc., etc. We take you through. You can do all that free of charge. You can have that, record the meeting if that's what you want to do, and you can then use that internally. Whether or not you continue with us is up to you, but very happy to look through your individual circumstances and see if we can help you. And any questions about that or anything to do with carbon, ESOS, CBAM, digital product passports, etc., etc. Just let us know. That's our game. That's what we do. And if we can help, as always, we certainly will. Okay, see you next time.